first, some promotions. There will be another LeSS conference in Amsterdam next year. I think it will be fun. And sometimes I do courses, not that many, but if you haven't been, you should be there. And then this talk. I don't really like standing on stages. Let me do what Tomek did. Good. Just a problem with my arm, length of my arm. Okay. What I'm going to, first of all, congratulations, you made it to the end of today. That's already quite an achievement. You have one presentation you have to go through again. This one is called How to Do a LeSS Adoption, and most of my talks, they start out with some frustration. And this talk started with two frustrations. The first one was that in LeSS adoptions, I felt in the community there was too much focus on what is sometimes called the flip. So the flip, and I'll talk about it in more detail later, is the event, usually 1 week, in which you are changing the organization, where you do typically some education and the self-designing workshop, etc. And it kind of gave the message that that's it. You just have that 1 week, you go from old to new, and you're done. But there's a lot more to LeSS adoptions than that. And I want to talk about the more also. And another frustration that I had was and I've already heard that also today, the sometimes difficultness of communication between people in a LeSS adoption and outside of a LeSS adoption. Right? And the reason for that difficulty tends to be because of different assumptions. Right? The people outside of a LeSS adoption, they have certain problems, problems related to dependencies or coordination or how do you plan or things like that, that don't exist anymore in a LeSS adoption. So often people would then ask, like, how did you guys solve that? And then the answer is like, oh no, that's not a problem. And that's very discouraging then for the people who are not yet in a LeSS adoption. So I'd like to tackle both of those frustrations. Now, when thinking about LeSS adoptions that I've been in, I've decided, or I've visualized them in this way. It has 3 phases plus a secret extra phase that takes the most amount of time. So in the secret extra phase is the one in the beginning, which is education. Right? Before your LeSS adoption starts, something has happened in your organization, in the people, that triggered the ideas of LeSS. Right? And this education period lasts between 1 week to 10 years. So it's very hard to figure out how long that lasts. So for example, some people know that I've been involved in a LeSS adoption in a private bank for a couple of years. And when I talk about that adoption, then I talk about the times that they were in that adoption, which is a couple of years. But I always leave out the whole thing that came before that. Right? It is as if I arrived there and then suddenly they changed and then they're suddenly in a successful LeSS adoption. Right? But what most people don't know is that before that was I think it was about 8 years of gradual education, where I met up with some of the management. They wanted to know about Scrum. We did some training. We went for some beers. We talked about that. I gave some hints. They wanted other people to know about that. They came some more, etc. So this is just a very long period, not very structured, and it kind of sets the ground for your LeSS adoption. Virtually every LeSS adoption has that. It doesn't really start like that. And then at some point, the organization goes like, you know what? This LeSS thing is kind of interesting. Now, then you do not immediately go and change your organization, because there's a couple of decisions that you need to make. And I call this the pre-less structure phase. Now, let me first focus on the word. I consider one of the most essential parts of less the less rules. I actually think they don't get enough emphasis. And the less rules kind of describe an organizational assumption. They describe a structure that is in your organization, and once you're in a less adoption, you kind of assume that structure. This is also where that conflict comes from, because the rules lead to a particular structure that leads to some problems not existing anymore. And once you have people that are not within that structure, they don't really talk in the same language. They don't have the same problems. And one of my favorite ones was recently somebody sent me a LinkedIn message, and he said, I have created a tool. Do you want to know about it? So I said, sure. Although usually the answer for tools is no. But anyway, I said, sure. And he said, I created a tool that will reduce the amount of meeting time that teams have in coordinating between the teams. Right? It will reduce it with, I don't know, an unrealistic number. And the only thing I could say was, but the teams I work with, they don't have meetings for coordination. So it is zero. So I don't need your tool really, because it's not useful, right? But he came from this pre-less structure where in his mind, coordination between teams is a big problem that you need to solve. But in the way less is structured, if you're in a less structure, coordination between teams is usually a little bit of a non-issue. So you're not really interested in talking about that, because there's other problems that you need to solve that are more interesting, that people that do not have the same assumptions of the structure, they will not have these problems, or they do not see these problems, and therefore you get this mismatch of coordination. So pre-less structure, again, it might last long, but usually say about six months, a year or so, and there's a couple of decisions you need to make. Then after you've made those decisions, you have often this one moment in time where you make that flip, which is what I mentioned earlier, where you typically have a 1 week workshop-y thing where you do certain things. We'll get there. And you change basically from a pre-less structure to a less structure. Now, after that, it will not immediately work. Or it will kind of work, but you'll get fairly predictable problems in the beginning that you'll need to solve, not because they don't work, but because people are not used to working in a certain way. So therefore, after that, there's this, I listed here as 6 months, which is basic less improvements. And what I mean by that is just getting used to the less way of working, getting used to a backlog refinement, getting used to how a planning work, etc. So improvements that are focused purely on the parts of less. And that's, you need to go through that, but in the end, you don't really want to focus improvements on the less parts. You want to focus improvements on your product, right? Because in the end, your product needs to continuously improve and get better, not your refinement. If after a while you're still figuring out the refinement, blah, 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 then you're kind of probably it just doesn't work at all, because you want to switch that focus on the product. So after that, we'll get a period of continuous product development. And then after that, this goes on until the main supporter, the person that typically in management that supported this less adoption, leaves, and then everything dies, and it sucks. And that's really what happens usually, because one of the problems that I wish we could solve, which is not, I have no idea how to solve that, is to make less adoption sustainable past the person that supports this either leaves or retires or things like that. Because if I look at the less adoptions I've been involved in, that's always what happened. I nowadays joke that I try to work with younger head of product so that they don't retire, because one of them retired and then it was very hard to continue after that. But anyway, then if you fix that, you'll end up in this sustaining less structure. And if you have the hope that I'm going to give you the answers to how to solve this problem, I will not. I do not have the answers. If you have ideas, tell me. Because this is really a hard problem to solve, and I wish that we would focus in the future more on solving that problem. Now, to be fair, this is not really related to LeSS. Any whatever way of working, when management changes, that way of working tends to go away. So it's a more generic problem than just related to LeSS. Okay, now what I'm going to do is the following. I'm first going to talk about the pre-LeSS structure, and I'm going to talk about the decisions you need to make, the really hard decisions. There's only 6 or so, but they're just very, very difficult. Then I'll talk about how the flip is structured. Then I'll talk a little bit about what are the things that I would expect you need to focus on once you started your LeSS adoption. And then what do you focus on afterwards? And then, as I said, the rest I don't know, so I will not talk about that. Okay. Educate, I talked about. Pre-LeSS structures, the decisions to make. The first decision that you need to make is, what is your product? So the product definition part of LeSS is perhaps one of the most controversial part of LeSS, right? I'll give a very, very brief overview of that. So in LeSS, you need to actually let me take a step back. And in most organizations, people think they know what the product is that they are working on. And usually they know that just because they joined the organization, they asked what is the product, somebody told them this is our product, and they just accepted that, and from then on they think they're working on that particular product. And those tend to be encoded within the organization, so changing that takes some time. Now, in LeSS, we don't want to, most of the time those products tend to be defined what we call in LeSS small. There's the idea in the world outside of the LeSS community that it's a good idea to create small products. Because if you have small products, then you can have a few amount of teams and they can work very efficiently on that small product and everything will be good. Except it won't, because all of those small products also need to collaborate together. So now you need to figure out how to do all the cross-product prioritization, coordination, collaboration, etc., etc., etc. So basically what you did is you've moved the problem rather than solved the problem, which is why in LeSS we prefer larger product definitions. Now, how do you determine your product definition? The first most important guide in LeSS related to product definition is try to make your product definition equal to that of your customer or larger. So what that basically means that, actually let me take a step back there again. Traditionally, most organizations define their product around technology. Right? So if you go somewhere and say, what is your product? They say, well, this system plus that system plus that system, those 3 systems is our product. Right? So therefore they defined it around a set of technology rather than around customer or customer problems. Right? So unless we want to switch that, and therefore the number 1 guideline for trying to figure out your product is simply go to your customer and say, hey customer, what is our product? Which sounds super weird, but very often you get a different answer than what you initially thought your product is. Often much broader. Now, sometimes you end up having a family of closely related products, and in that case, unless we say family of closely related products together can best be managed as one product, so therefore we make the product definition larger than how our customer views our product, but we try to never make it smaller. However, because what I mentioned earlier, your organizational structure tends to be related to your previous product definition. If you therefore decide on a very large product definition, it means a lot of change in your organization. Because from a larger I don't know if this sentence is going to work. From a larger product definitions perspective, your smaller products are component teams. And so therefore, once you adopt LeSS, you will remove those organizations and change their structure. So therefore, the larger product definition you choose, the larger initial change you'll have. And therefore, this relates strongly to what level of support do you have within your organization. And often you end up with choosing a less perfect, smaller product definition simply because you don't have enough support yet. But all of the other decisions that you'll need to make are related to this one. So this is absolutely the first one, because all of the other questions will be within the context of what have you decided your product definition to be. For all of these, to stress this less rules part that I mentioned before, for all of the rules, for all of the questions, I've added the rules that are related to that question at the bottom, just for your reference. Now, once we know what our product is, then we can look for the product owner. And again, we're here in a LeSS conference, so I assume that all of you know each product has one product owner, not more than one product owner, not product owners per team, which I'll get to on the next slide. So you need to find your one product owner, and the best guideline is the product owners that you have now are probably not your product owner. Right? Rarely is the product owner for your product one of the team product owners. So usually you'll need to look at the easiest way to find your product owner is who's making prioritization decisions right now. And in most traditional organizations, prioritization decisions are made through budgeting. So therefore, you just have to ask who's now controlling the budget of whatever we defined our product, and that person is probably the product owner. Right? So the product owner tends to also be a fairly senior person in the organization. So if you have a product company, then it is often, for example, head of product management. That becomes the product owner. If you have more of an IT-ish company where you have this business IT split, the person that decides on the budget for your IT, that is probably the product owner. Right, so somebody that organizationally tends to be fairly senior, really has authority to make these kind of decisions, is what would be the product owner in LeSS. Now, once you've done that, almost always do you end up with team product owners that are not useful anymore. And one of the hardest thing in almost all LeSS adoptions is to, and I'll be rude here, get rid of the team product owners. Because there is no role team product owner. It just doesn't exist. Don't rename it. Don't move them somewhere else. Don't put them in the team and let them do exactly the same as that they did before. Because all of that will not work. Team product owners from a LeSS perspective are simply harmful for your LeSS adoption, and therefore very early on you have to move them away. Elevate. Don't do that. It's elevate is very dangerous. In one of the very first LeSS huge adoptions, we did that with project managers. We sent them to another product, and we done that for 2 years, and then we expanded the product definition, and they came all back. We're like, so this this problem is really one of the largest problems, and most LeSS adoptions, they try to sneak out of avoiding hard decisions here. Either they make multiple product owners the product owner by creating a product owner team, or they move them to product management and you have too much people in product management now, or you move them into the team and they still do exactly the same thing. So you really want to tackle this problem. Usually it is either you move into the team and you become a normal team member, which is likely that you'll be working on also, for example, development work, or they go somewhere else. Those are the most common ways of moving your team product owners somewhere else. Again, I'm repeating myself over and over again, but almost every LeSS adoption, this is the one decision that nobody dares to make. Right? That they make shortcuts, they postpone it, they send people on job rotation and they come back a year later. There's all kinds of ways to avoid making this decision, but you really want to make it early because it has a huge impact on your LeSS adoption. Okay, now that we have a product definition, we have the product owner, we figured out what to do with the team product owners, then we can think about what the organizational structure is going to be. And again, LeSS adoptions, LeSS is an organizational design, which means that virtually all LeSS adoptions start with a change in organization. LeSS does not work well when you don't change your organization because you'll get conflicts. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, there's a couple of decisions that you'll need to make. So I'll start with the bottom one, the definition of done. The definition of done in LeSS is a weird thing because it has the same name as the definition of Scrum, definition of done in Scrum, but it is actually something different. And a definition of done is the current capability of the team. And one of the very first things you need to decide is what is our definition of done, because that determines the change in your organization. So, for example, if you have an organization with a development department and test department, say data science department, UX department, and systems verification department, which of those are you going to put within your team? Right, that's the very first decision. It's important because in LeSS you do not have functional departments. So if you have a dev, QA, UX department, you delete those. Right? And when we talk about cross-functional teams, this is the very first rule, also the very first rule of the LeSS rules. Structure the organization using real teams as basic building block in your organization. So that means that you don't, cross-functional teams doesn't mean a group of people reporting to different functional managers. It means not having functional managers anymore. Right? Once you have a group of people reporting to different functional managers, it's not really a building block of the organization then, right? It's in fact not at all visible in your organization. Right? But being a building block in your organization means that you have team, and team tends to report up to one now cross-functional manager. Right? So that means that very first decision you tend to make is you remove the dev, QA, UX departments completely. You have the head of dev, head of QA, and the head of UX that you'll need to figure out again what to do with them. And you restructure the teams so that you have cross-functional teams as a building block of your organization that tend to report organizationally to one or one cross-functional manager. Given that context, you need to decide how much of those functional skills are we going to integrate in the team. Right? So if we go back to the example, dev, QA, UX, data science, systems verification, we could choose to integrate them all into the team from day one. That means that all of those functional departments ceases to exist and your team will not create any output in the beginning because that's a huge problem to solve. right? For the team to figure out how to do all of those things within a sprint is a big problem and a big learning journey. So therefore, you need to balance a little bit with how much learning do I expect from the team while still being able to create some output? Because teams that don't create any output become very demotivated. Right? So therefore you decide dev and QA, that always goes in the team. Then we have UX. Putting UX in the team means that UX developers UX designers probably need to also pick up some front-end work, and other people need to pick up UX. Not this kind of pre-work. I'll get to that in a moment. Do we want to solve that problem now? Right? What about data science? When we put it in the team, do we want to solve that problem now? What about systems verification? Do we put it in the team? That's the main decision that you'll need to make. What problems do we want our teams in the beginning to solve? And that impacts the amount of change you have in your organization, and that sets your improvement goal, because eventually all of them should be gone and integrated in the team. It's just a question, do you do it in the beginning or do you do that later? Now, one of the key problems that you'll need to solve, one of the key learnings that the teams need to solve is and this is so frequent that I want to stress this one, is the change from serial work to parallel work. Right? So the easiest one to explain is with just development and QA. Whereas in a traditional organization, you develop, you're done, you hand it over to QA, they test, and they're done. And if you do that in a sprint, it will not work, right? Because then you move all of the risk of the test towards the end. Hopefully they happen to finish in time, but in practice it just doesn't work. So therefore, what you need to do when you move something in a sprint, a new skill, is you need to figure out how to change a sequential activity to a parallel activity. So how can we do development and test at the same time? Now, this makes this a good example, because from development test, this has been solved a long time ago, because through proper test automation, you can start in day one with your test. You don't need to wait anymore. The only thing that the only thing that should never happen is that your test pass before your development is finished. Because then something is probably wrong. But other than that, they can all be in parallel. So development finish, run the test, at least a couple of minutes later, your test is also finished. That cannot be the other way around. So you've taken a sequential process and made it parallel. This is also why often people that like LeSS are actually not very enthusiastic about Kanban. Because Kanban tends to map out your process. And when you map out your process, you almost always map it out sequentially. And then they're going to improve within the mindset of that sequential process. But we don't want to stick to that sequential process mindset. We want to parallelize them. And at that point, your typical Kanban flow is not very useful, or not super useful anymore, because it will just have not started, finished, and something in between, and that's it. Because the more stages doesn't work, because it suggests sequential work. Now, development test is the easiest one, but as I mentioned already, more fun is, for example, UX, where traditionally the fake UX persons integrated in the team, they do the work, the UX preparation work, the 1 or 2 sprints ahead, and they make the UX design in a PDF, and then the sprint starts, and then poof, here's your UX design, and then the developers have basically no input in it anymore. So that is not integrated in the team, at least from my perspective, and it is the same problem, because what is happening is that we have this parallel activity. We assume they must be sequential activity. We assume they must be sequentially, and therefore once you start integrating in the team, the key learning that the team needs to do is how can we do this in parallel. And that is usually a big shift in thinking for the teams. And trying to put all of those sequential processes in the team from day one will just blow up your team. And that is why you need to make that choice and restrict the amount of learning that the team has. And you do that using the definition of done. And then the last, and since we're in a LeSS conference, most of you hopefully know that, we also switch from component to feature teams. So traditionally we have organizations, a front-end team, a back-end team, etc. Unless you don't have that. Instead, the teams do not in any way map to your architecture. Right? So if you want to know, do you have feature teams, component teams, very easy. Just think about what are the names of your team. If a name of your team is related to what they do, you have component teams. Feature teams also have names, but they are silly names and they do not relate to what they actually do. Okay, so here you basically decide what is the organization going to be, and on this flip event you also flip and change from the old organization to the new organization. Functional departments are deleted with the exception of the functional departments that are outside of the definition of done. Usually you just keep them in place and you name them undone departments, and you remind them constantly that we're working on removing you, and eventually one day that will happen. And I know it's not super motivating for the people in the undone department usually, but you do want to be clear on that. Then location and vendor strategy. These are wonderful. So LeSS still very much focuses on co-located teams. Even, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but even post COVID, we still consider co-located teams to be significant better for maximizing the way the teams work and the learning that the teams create. Right? Co-location is mostly for that. Does the team work well as a team, and do they as a team learn a lot? Our experience is that remote work functions well to create output, but it doesn't really function well to create well-working teams and maximize team learning. And those are two essential parts. So therefore, one of the most controversial parts of the LeSS rules is this one, and here I just focus on the co-located part. So teams need to be co-located. My definition of co-location is the team sits around the same table. Right? I heard it somewhere also, again, this idea of virtual co-location. I find that really a funny contradiction. We're co-located in teams. It's like, really? Anyway, so one team sits around the same table. So in the beginning, especially post-COVID, you'll need to have this discussion, which is, are we really going to have co-located teams? There are reasons for not having co-located teams, right? And that's what you want to talk about. What are the real reasons why, if we don't have the teams co-located, what is the real reason that they're not co-located? And is the cost of non-co-located team worth that reason? In my experience, most of the time the answer is probably no, and then you'll need to figure out how are we going to co-locate the teams. Now, unfortunately, actually, let me turn that sentence around also. From a pure product development perspective, I strongly recommend that the team is in the office 5 days a week. No, from a pure product development perspective, 7 days might be even better, but we'll accept that humans need rest. So 5 days would be best. But nowadays, especially post-COVID, the world expectation has changed a little bit, and it might not be always the right choice to make this co-location decision purely from a product development perspective, right? You might consider that expectations of your people, because of course if you decide, say, 7 days a week and then everyone quits, it will not be super good for your product development either. So you need to have that balance in that decision. Now, therefore, most organizations tend to end up with a hybrid way of working, and hybrid ways of working can work reasonably well, and they're much closer to true co-location, as long as you follow a couple of very simple rules. And these might seem weird for people who consider that you need to empower your teams with decisions. In this case, not. So therefore, do not let people, if you choose, say, 2 days in the office, do not let people choose which days. Right? It is not useful, because then what will happen is everyone chooses another day, they go into the office, they put on a headphone and they join a Zoom or Teams meeting, and you have no benefit of being in the office. So if you do that, then you can just as well skip the whole mandatory office days. So therefore you say Monday and Wednesday, all of the teams need to be in the office. So don't let the teams choose either, because unless the cross-team collaboration is super important. And if you let the teams choose, what happens is that this team comes on Monday and that team comes on Tuesday, and now you've optimized your in-team communication, but you've suffered your cross-team collaboration. So don't do that. Simply say everyone has to be in office on Monday and Thursday, whatever days you pick. Usually it's 2 or 3 or something, and then you'll get dynamics that are close enough to the benefits of co-location. Last thing, advice related to co-location, is use the office days for your LeSS events. Right? So the LeSS events are the ones that have maximum high interaction, especially backlog refinement, sprint planning. So make sure that you plan those events in office days so that you actually maximize the benefits of being co-located within your teams. Okay. Next, vendor strategy. This might not seem less related, but it is very less related. And if it's relevant for you, it is very relevant for you. Because many organizations, many products, they use vendors, but they use vendors to build a part of the product. Right? So they basically give a component and give it to a particular vendor. That means that if you have that kind of vendors, you automatically end up with component teams, and all of the problems with component teams even worse. Right? Because of course in component teams you need to have the teams synchronized with each other. If now the teams are in different vendors, then of course we can't have the vendors talk to each other. So then we have somebody in our company that talks to both of these vendors and tries to do the collaboration, which, like, one of the I will not even say the industry, it's too sensitive, but a company I worked with, they had like 100 developers, and they decided to offshore it somewhere, and they sent them off to multiple vendors, and they hired 100 project managers. And they saved, of course, a lot of money by their outsourcing, offshoring, and vendor usage. Right? So therefore, if you have that kind of vendor strategy, it basically means you have to insource again the components that you've outsourced previously. Right? Now, this might sound very big, but if you think about it a bit further, there's a very obvious reason, which is most of the component outsourcing to vendors is for cost reasons. For cost optimization, that might make sense. But unless we try to not optimize for minimizing cost, but maximizing flexibility. Once you look at it from that perspective, having multiple components to different vendors becomes a mess. Because when something changes, you need to change all the contracts with your vendors and coordinate it with all of them. So therefore, for adaptiveness, flexibility perspective, sending parts of your system to vendors is just a super, super bad idea. right? So the difference is that change of optimization goal towards maximizing cost efficiency to maximizing flexibility, and the result of that is a change in your vendor strategy. Now, there are this does not mean that in a less adoption everyone needs to be uh, working for your company. You can still use vendors, but usually you use either time and material contracts, have vendor teams that work across the whole system, and don't put scope in vendor contracts, etc. So it's okay to use vendors or external coaches or consultants, just don't give components to vendors. Sorry to spend such a long time on this, but again, if you are in that situation, it is a huge change in shift of strategy of your organization. So those decisions, I think I have another slide for that. No. Those decisions are the hardest decisions to make. They have the biggest impact on your LeSS adoption. And after you've made those decisions, then you can start your LeSS flip. And so that's the point where you change from whatever you had before to a structure that is described by the LeSS rules. Now, what do you do in a flip? Usually a flip event takes about 1 week, and these are the typical things that you'll do. You start with education. You want to educate all of the people in all of the teams. And in most of the LeSS adoptions I've been in, it's the 3-day LeSS course that all team members go through, because they really, really need to have a deep understanding of some of these concepts. If not, they don't understand why you're making this change. And if they don't understand why you're making this change, they are going to either go with it or sabotage it eventually. So make sure that everyone, they don't have to agree, but at least understand why you're doing that. So education, then product visioning. Obviously, you should already have some kind of product vision. The product owner should have one, but it's good to involve the teams in product visioning, wording it, describing it in a good way, maybe expanding or changing it a little bit. It early on leads to more ownership of the teams to the product. Then you need to create your initial product backlog. There's 2 ways of doing that. Use the team backlogs and merging them. I've never seen that successful. Throw away all of the backlogs that you have and create a new one. Usually that's what people end up doing. The team backlogs tend to be way too task oriented and too detailed to be meaningfully merge them into a new backlog. So create your initial backlog, then restructure the teams through usually a self-designing team workshop. Self-designing team workshop basically means you get all of the people in a room. So all of this is still basic LeSS, so that's around 50, and you say form new teams, and then you wait until the chaos is resolved, and then you have teams, and then you typically do that in 1 or 2 or 3 iterations, and then you have teams. Then teams create names. You need to figure out what to do with these Scrum Masters. A while ago, we would let the teams choose Scrum Masters, but this is an concept that I've completely changed my mind on. Now I suggest the Scrum Masters together with management decides which Scrum Master works with which team, even if that team doesn't want a Scrum Master. The reason is very simple. As a Scrum Master, you need to get your team to work. When you have the self-designing team workshop, almost always do you have an idea of which team are going to be easier to get to work, which ones are going to be harder to get to work, and you want to match the Scrum Masters with more experience to the ones that are harder, so that you can help those teams also grow. So make that decision. team needs to create some initial working agreements and then basically do some refinement and planning. And we're done. We've flipped and we're now in a LeSS structure. I'll take the questions after. Sorry. I'll try to make the after faster. Then we're there. Then the first things that you're going to hear is our product backlog refinement doesn't work. I think I've not been in any LeSS adoption where the first complaints was our backlog refinement doesn't work. Therefore, I suggest to immediately focus on that. Now, there's something interesting on this slide, and that is the retrospective is in the end instead of in the beginning. And in the past, we would say you start with the retrospective, and then you improve the retrospective, and then you'll know the next thing to improve. But because the next thing to improve is always backlog refinement, I stopped with improving retrospective, because I know the answer already anyway. We need to improve backlog refinement. If your backlog refinement doesn't work, your sprint planning is a mess. Your sprint planning will not work. Your sprint is a mess, etc. So make sure your backlog refinement functions well. So again, very brief, backlog refinement. Nowadays, it's always a multi-team event. All of the members of all of the teams are in a multi-team backlog refinement. Don't do representatives. Don't prepare for backlog refinements either. It will make them a mess. It is a workshop, so expect it to last half a day to a full day. Make clear to everyone that backlog refinement is for learning. It is for learning on your customer domain. That's the main activity there. Because the teams had a small scope, a component team, now they have a big scope, the whole product, there's this huge learning depth related to domain and the customers. And in the initial refinement, the teams will need to pay back that years of learning depth. Right? This is where we move the traditional business analysis kind of activities inside the teams. That happens in refinement. Right? So focus on your refinement, really important. And once your refinement works, then Sprint Planning 1. Sprint Planning 1 is my favorite of the LeSS events, because in Sprint Planning 1, you can, within about 1 minute, see how well your LeSS adoption is doing. Because when your refinement isn't working, your Sprint Planning 1 is a chaos, so that you know immediately. But the key thing that you see in Sprint Planning 1 is that how well the teams are collaborating. So therefore, I look for two things. The first one is a Sprint Planning 1 a team meeting or a team PO meeting. Right? It should be a team meeting, which basically means the product owner says, here, top of the backlog, and the team say, thank you, and they talk between each other on which team is going to work on what. Right? The product owner has almost no input in your Sprint Planning 1 anymore beyond this is the top of the backlog. Right? And then 2, do the teams talk about what they want or what is best for the product? Right? So in the discussions between the team, do they say, I would like to work on this? Or do they say, for this item, it's probably best that that team works on it, right? So they think about their individual team's perspective, or they think about the whole product perspective. That is immediately visible in the communication in Sprint Planning 1. Right? Like recently I had a funny Sprint Planning 1 a couple of weeks ago, and we're sitting there, and the first item is picked up by one of the teams, and suddenly a fairly stereotypical developer raises his hand and says, I object. And everyone is like, why? And it's like, this team is also on maintenance duty, and they're trying to pick up the highest priority item. We don't want to do it, but I object. Right? So by the we don't want to do it, he clearly said, it's not that my team wants to do it, but I simply consider it wrong that the team that also has maintenance duty picks up the highest priority item. right? That is a whole product focus, not a my team focus. And that's what you're looking for in your sprint planning one. Then after that, you tend to focus on improving the office space to actually be a collaborative space. Because once you hear me talk a lot about co-location, but co-location means more than just having people in the office. Like the typical, don't know if you guys have visited the typical US style cubicle offices. Cubicles this high, and you can't see anything, and you're kind of lost very quickly. You don't know where you are anymore. Of course, those people theoretically are in the office either, but it's not a collaborative space, right? Or setting up your team so that I once visited a company. They said we made a collaborative space, and I said show me, and I set up the table so that everyone was sitting with the back to each other. Right? And they were at least sitting close to each other, but with the back to each other. That means what? That if you need to talk with your colleague, you first need to turn around, and then you see the back of your colleague, so you don't know if he's actually interruptible or not. If you're unlucky, they have their headphones, so you go like, "Hey, John, 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 talk, talk, talk." Right? That's not a collaborative space. Right? So you need to make sure that the teams are actually sitting on one table, sitting together with each other, so that you have a space that you actually use that space. And that doesn't happen immediately. One of the adoptions I'm involved in now, one of my favorite moments was I was sitting there in an office at some point. They have these glass windows, and suddenly I see the teams moving furniture around. I go like, what's going on? And then they have this measuring tape, and they're measuring things in the floor. And that was the moment that the teams decided, we are going to take ownership of the office space and make it more collaborative. At some point in your LeSS adoption, that will happen. Then the next thing that will happen is the teams start working on shared code, and they're causing conflicts with each other. And these conflicts are good. These are the conflicts that lead you to be able to increase the quality because you're working with multiple teams rather than decrease it. Right? What is happening is that independent on your organizational standards, with component or siloed teams, each team has their own standard of quality, their quality level. And then once you start working across the teams in the same code base, the quality levels of the different teams become visible. So for example, this team here is very fanatical about writing unit tests, and this team here doesn't care about it so much, right? The organizational standard says write a unit test when needed. And in their opinion, never. Right? So they go and change a piece of code that they are working in more frequently, and they don't write a unit test. And then you got this conflict between them. Right? And again, this conflict is good, but you now, especially as coach Scrum Master, need to focus that this team isn't avoiding this conflict. And isn't going to talk to within the team and saying, oh, that team doesn't write, they're idiots, they don't write unit tests, because that destroys your team relationship and doesn't improve your quality. Instead, you need to have these in the open. So you get the teams together and you say, okay, what is the expected engineering level within our organization? And that way you build those shared engineering standards, and creating these shared engineering standards, that is what leads to quality to go up dramatically once you work with multiple teams together. And then you need to focus on the overall retrospective, because at that point I don't know anymore what the typical problem is going to be. So then you focus on the overall retrospective to discover what's the next problem you want to work on. Then after the 6 months period, you'll move into more improvement on the product itself. This is, if you wish, the actual goal of a lot of these earlier improvements is that the improvements become visible in the quality, flexibility of your product. So first one, the first two are related. Role removal. Delay role removal means that, in the beginning, in the pre-LeSS structure, you said, for example, oh, we still have one architect. Let's not remove him. How harmful can one architect outside of the team be anyway? So you kind of took that shortcut, if you wish, and then once you start, you notice it was not a good idea. And then you'll gradually start removing some of the roles that you left in the beginning. And of course, this is related to definition of done, where you say, okay, now we're ready to also integrate UX into the teams. Right? So that means you delete the UX department, you move them into the team, and the teams will have to figure out how to integrate this particular skill within the team. Parallelizing work I talked about. Then it moves to more and more ownership and continuous improvement driven by the team. This is hilarious because this drives some Scrum Masters nuts. Because what happens is that in, say sprint planning, in the beginning, as a coach or Scrum Master, you tend to be quite prescriptive. You say, a planning goes like this, and you help them facilitate that, and etc. And eventually, the teams don't like it, and they go, no, we don't want to do it. We want to do it like this, and that's a good thing. So when they undo the things that you did earlier, that's a good thing, because what is happening is they're taking more ownership. They're not just following your suggestions. So you need to swallow all of your pride and then just let them do that, as long as they're achieving the purpose of that particular event. Right? It doesn't matter how they achieve it. It's their event. So you want to gradually move more and more ownership towards the teams. Then improvement in automation, standardization, improvement in continuous integration. At this point, you're probably ready to talk about abandoning pull requests in your organization. Yay! It's a good thing to not do pull requests or any kind of branches, but it takes a while before your organization is ready to even have that conversation. You move the teams more and more customer-centric. This also means that you'll need to help your team talk more to customers. Like in one of the LeSS adoptions, one of the LeSS adoptions, we wanted teams to challenge the customer requirements, right? Ask them, what problem are you solving, right? But the effect might be that your customer says, I would like this feature, and the team said, no, you don't. And that's the wrong answer at that point. So they need to learn to talk in a way that doesn't piss off your customers and stakeholders and start that conversation. That's also a new skill for many of the teams. And then eventually you'll broaden your product definition. And as I said, then management changes and all the work that you've worked on for the last 8 years goes down the drain. And people quit and they do the same thing somewhere else, and you move to another company and go through it all over again. And I wish we didn't need to go through that. Sorry for the depressing end note of this talk. But that is practically, unfortunately, what often happens. If you have any ideas on how to prevent that, let me know, because that is, again, a hard problem to solve. With that, I am going to end it.